Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat.
This is a person that I'm very interested in discussing because I never heard her name until I started following your Instagram channel. She was dubbed the Lady Al Capone of Washington, D.C. and the Queen of the Washington Underworld. Talk to me about the flamboyant personality who was able to maneuver and become successful in a male-dominated field. I'm talking about Odessa Madre.
Yes, another fascinating character in an underworld scene of Washington, D.C. that you don't really hear about very often, especially in another sector of organized crime, the Black community. As you mentioned, Odessa Madre, they called her the Lady Al Capone and the Queen of the DC underworld. She was a colorful and compelling and affluent character. She was one of Washington, D.C.'s most successful underworld figures ever. She was flamboyant. She was flashy. She compiled her empire during the 1930s as a prominent liquor-serving joint and brothel entrepreneur. So those are just like, whorehouses. Yeah, exactly. That sell liquor during Prohibition. And she could often be seen decked out in lavish mink coats, mingling with music artists, legendary musical artists like Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, Count Basie, and Billie Holiday. And they would often perform at her Club Madre, which was in, I'm not sure what section of DC it is in right now, but I know it's still standing, the building at least. And if you go look at my Instagram account, that's actually on there. And she was known to host big time parties there. She owned plenty of brothels, and they all employed upwards of 20 women. And she could often be seen with a lot of them by her side. So I don't know if there's proof, but I believe she might have been lesbian, which obviously doesn't matter. And she was known to flaunt large bank rolls when she went on her massive headline making spending sprees. I actually was able to find some of those headline making spending sprees in the newspapers archives that I have access to. It's pretty cool stuff. And whenever she left her house, she always had a bodyguard by her side. She had a few different cars. She could be often seen in her hot Lincoln Continental. And in 1990, she was still alive around this time, but at her death, a former Vice Squad officer told the Washington Post that, quote, Odessa loaned a lot of money to needy people as well as provided contacts for gambling and drugs. She knew practically every big-time gangster nationwide. She was what they call a counselor in the mob. She mediated disputes between black and whites like a referee. She kept a lot of people from getting hurt. So that quote says a lot about her and her reputation in a male-dominated scene of organized crime. Lady Odessa Madre really was feared as any and respected as any, as you can tell. She allegedly had a net income of over $100,000 in her day, which is obviously a lot of money during that time. And she never had to leave D.C. So, she had the police department in her pockets. They say she even practically ran that herself. She was really just a lifelong underworld character. She controlled many rackets. She was arrested 30 times on 57 charges. She served time for robbery, narcotics, gambling, and more. And she died a sad death with really no money. They say she was really taken advantage of in her final days. And she actually passed penniless in 1990. And when you mentioned that post on my Instagram page, that post actually got lots of love. I think that this woman deserves like a movie on her life. There's a lot of gaps in her story, but I know she was a very prominent character in DC in every community. I mean, it's not too often that you hear of someone called Lady Al Capone. So she's a true queen pin, and I think she deserves to have her story come to the forefront a little bit, and it deserves to be known. So I think for the listeners, that's definitely somebody you might want to check out. There's not many pictures of her, but I also have a quote from her that I thought was cool. And it was, "If you show them that money, if you got a wad, honey, they'll suck up to you like you was a Tootsie Roll." So I thought that was funny too. And she's definitely an intriguing character, Lady Odessa Madre, and one of my favorites actually to research. And when I came across her, I just knew I had to put something together on her life.
Yeah, I can't believe I've went my whole life without even hearing her name, like you said. And then, in preparation for the show, I dived in a little bit, and I'm like, yeah, why is there no movie about her? I literally can't find anything on YouTube about her. I had to go to Google and Google her. And it's amazing that her name is one that doesn't stand out. She was apparently rumors. You mentioned the lesbian thing. She apparently was rumored to have an affair or relationship with Mons Mabley.
Right.
And,
I did see that.
Yeah. I heard that. And as well, you mentioned that, she was, everybody was cool with her, the whites, the blacks. Apparently she grew up in an area that was half black, half Irish, which kind of helped her during her career, since a lot of her Irish, the Irish people she grew up with ended up becoming high-ranking members of the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah. Yep. And it's interesting too that you talk about how she was brought up in that black and Irish community. Like you said, I think that really helped her make a footing, just because, Washington, D.C. now is like a pretty cultural place. But back then, a lot of the police departments were ran by like Irish guys in America, or Irish people. I'm not sure if you have any familiarity with that, but I know that was like...
My last name is Sullivan, so there you go.
Oh, yeah.
Half white.
You know what I'm saying then? I know like a lot, just for example, like Nucky Johnson, excuse me, from Atlantic City. Like he was the sheriff of Atlantic City. That's a big time Irish family. That's just an example. I know Chicago had their Irish police department. So being from that Irish community, I think that really helped her. And like I said, I think she at one point controlled some of the police departments in DC. Whether she was paying them off or she was just feared, either way, she's definitely somebody that should have her story told on a larger scale. And like I said, that post that I made got more love than like any of my other posts. So I think she's somebody that really has caught the eye of some people. She's very unique, of course. And like I said, I think she definitely deserves to have her story told more often than not.
Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat.
Oakland's first large-scale drug kingpin. I'm talking about Felix the Cat Mitchell. Talk to me about him.
Yes, the godfather of San Antonio Village projects. Felix the Cat, at a young age, knew that he was not going to be living in the poverty-stricken environment that he was coming up in. I think he was unlike many of his age, where he could sit and plot as a youngster and really notice what's going on around him. Of course, he came up in the 50s and 60s and early 70s in a very pivotal time for the black community, with the civil rights movement and the rise of the drug trade, the end of the Vietnam War, and a lot of stuff going on in the country at that time. Really, you see the shift of the drug trade, which is another fascinating thing to look at. And this is where I was kind of talking about before. It kind of shifts from the Italian mob and the Italian community controlling it over. It trickles into the black communities. And this is something that Felix the Cat would take care of and take advantage of himself. He was the founding boss of Oakland's notorious 6ix9ine mob, sometimes just called the Mob, and I believe that was in the 69th Street area of Oakland. And this would become a very powerful drug organization, and he founded this as a teen. And he turned it into a narcotics empire, controlling a vast heroin trade, at first cohorting with drug bosses from LA, including Tootie Reese, and reaching as far as Detroit and other major cities in New York. And at first, he didn't really deal with much rivalry or much violence, but this kind of changes in the 80s with the rise of cocaine and the drug trade, and as well as him fueling the drug trade in his city, which created other rival groups and enemies, and more violence came as time went on. And these top competitors would be the likes of Mickey Moore, aka Mickey Mo, and Funktown USA, led by Harvey Wissington. And apparently Harvey was part of his crew, part of Felix's crew, before he broke off and started his own thing. And after a while, violence, it was, inevitable. They kind of just dealt with it. Oakland kind of turned into, locals called it a war zone. Excuse me. And like I mentioned before, as cocaine started to come into the game, that was a little bit more cutthroat drug to control. And, you see guys walking the streets with like automatics and stuff like that in Oakland, and just big time weaponry that really just, they kind of say happened in a sense overnight over there. But nonetheless, his 6ix9ine mob's enterprise, Felix the Cat, really flourished. He was making millions, living a flashy lifestyle, and giving back to his community. And this lasted for him from like the late 70s all the way up till 85, when he would be arrested. And I think this is really when, he kind of had more notoriety at this point with the rise of the war on drugs and all of that scene, which is something that, people I think should definitely look into if they're interested in this kind of stuff. That's probably, I would say, my favorite thing to study in all this stuff was the drug trade around this time, and how it affects different communities and so on and so forth. So he was arrested in 85, and he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life. And he would find himself in Leavenworth Prison in Pennsylvania, and I believe that's in Pennsylvania. And there he would be stabbed to death during a dispute of some sort. He was standing up for somebody, and tables turned on him, and he got stabbed, killed. And what really put him on the map was actually his lavish funeral, which was seen on a national level on news broadcasts with images and film showing his some 8,000 mourners, standing by the procession, including multiple Rolls Royces and limos, and his, famous 6K casket being carried by a horse-drawn carriage. And this was really what put Felix Cat Mitchell on a map nationally. I don't think many people outside of the black communities and inner cities really knew what was going on until, this time period in history, with Felix the Cat Mitchell really being the forefront and the face of this time. And what the impact of drugs had on inner cities. People were really, starting to take note of this. Of course, like I said before, with the rise of the war on drugs and all of that, Felix the Cat Mitchell's story in his life and his funeral is where people began to see the impact of drugs on inner cities. And when Felix the Cat died, Oakland somehow got even more violent because there wasn't a guy who was able to control the drug trade like he did. Now, you know, this is something that's apparent in many cities of the time. You know, you had your major players in pretty much every city, and it's comparable to as someone I always go back to. Same kind of thing happened in Harlem a little bit earlier when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson died in the late '60s. You started to see a lot of new independent operators jumping into the drug game. And a lot more violence coming along too. So Felix the Cat Mitchell is the godfather of Oakland in that sense, of where he really demanded respect and he controlled it. And without him, you know, all hell broke loose because there was nobody like him who can control the drug trade in his city. So Felix the Cat is another fascinating character. And of course, his enterprise would more or less be inherited by Lil D, Darrell Reed in Oakland with the rise of the crack era, which was a whole new time in itself. And, you know, I kind of cut to the chase on the Felix the Cat Mitchell story, but he is a legend. And like I said, he is just one of many of his kind. This kind of thing was happening in many different cities. You know, you had big time players in Philadelphia, New York City, Chicago. Detroit is another major city when it comes to the early days of the, you know, black organized crime and black drug trade, stuff like that. So it's just a really fascinating time in organized crime history. Probably one of my favorites, just studying the shift of the drug trade. And like I said, Felix the Cat Mitchell was right at the top of that.
And during this time period, you know, before like the Lil D's of the world took over and crack was the big drug, were they making the majority of their money off of heroin? Is that safe to say?
I would say that it started off with heroin, yes. And this was like the late 60s through the 70s. And then with the rise of the cocaine cartels in Colombia and South America and Mexico, you know, doing their thing, helping out with that, then you started to see cocaine come into play. And this was, you know, around the early 80s through the 80s, really. And about midway through then was when they started smoking cocaine. So it kind of went heroin, then cocaine came into play, and it was kind of both of them. And then, you know, you don't really exactly freebasing, and then they just started smoking crack, and that was like the new thing. And you could also, this is what they call the game, so you could actually include pimping and gambling in that sequence. Pimping and gambling were the two major things, and then you had your drug dealers too. The guys started to find out that drug dealing was the real moneymaker. And I'll give you an example. There was a big time legendary kingpin in Detroit by the name of Eddie Fatman Jackson. And him and a guy by the name of John Klassen, they were the pioneering dope dealers in heroin, dope wholesalers in Detroit, dealing heroin. And when guys in the game in Detroit, you know, in the black community, pimps and gamblers saw the money that these guys were making, overnight they dropped what they were doing and became dope dealers. All the top gamblers and pimps, and this was happening in every city. I'm most well versed on this, seen in Harlem. I know most of the major players during this time, and the same kind of thing happened. Like I said before, you had Bumpy Johnson controlling everything in the black community. And then he died, and guys would come about. I know a lot of people like to talk about the Frank Lucases and the Nicky Barnes, but there were guys before them. There was a guy by the name of Jimmy Goldfinger Terrell, who was first heroin godfather of Harlem, in my opinion. You know, post Bumpy Johnson, there was another guy by the name of Big Robbie Stepney. There was a guy by the name of Walter Grant, who started off as a lieutenant of Jimmy Goldfinger Terrell. But Jimmy Goldfinger Terrell was a major player. I believe that he might have even plugged Felix the Cat at one point. I'm not positive on that, but he definitely plugged Fat Man Jackson. He definitely put Fat Man Jackson of Detroit into touch with Gambino crime family in New York City to get their drugs. I'm rambling on about this. I'm, getting off, but yeah, it's my favorite time period, I think. So definitely a great thing to look at. Well, some might argue differently, but it's a time that I'm really fascinated about. I think if you're into this kind of stuff, it's something that some people should also look into.
Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat.
Bugsy Siegel, the first Hollywood gangster, and I put that in quotes. Talk to me about Bugsy Siegel and how he made his way up the ranks to become one of the most infamous gang figures in mob history.
It's funny that you said the first gangster to go Hollywood, because that was actually the first thing that I was going to mention. So Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, arguably the most legendary Jewish mobster of all time, right up there with his partner, Meyer Lansky. He really was instrumental in finding or founding what is modern day organized crime. And I'll get a little bit into that as I get deeper into what I'm talking about with Bugsy Siegel. So Bugsy really started off as a petty thug on the streets of Brooklyn. He formed his first gang as a teenager, extorting push carts and storefront owners in Brooklyn to pay protection money to him. He would threaten them, of course, if they didn't, or maybe beat them up or whatever it may be, kind of like what you see in the movies and stuff like that. Around 1918 was when he really started getting into life of crime as far as a career for Bugsy. And this is when he met his future business partner, and I guess you could say he was his friend, Meyer Lansky, who is really the Jewish godfather of organized crime. And they formed what was called the Bugs and Meyer mob. And this is really Bugsy's first taste of the rackets. They started off stealing cars and other smaller petty crimes on a larger scale. And with the, with liquor being illegal during the beginning of Prohibition, they made lots of money bootlegging. And this really lasted through the 20s. And Meyer was the more mellow, business-minded one of the two, while Bugsy was the more ill-tempered, strong-arm type of the top of that mob. And at some point during the 20s, they really got in touch with, of course, the infamous Italian mafia boss, Lucky Luciano. And they were both still young. They were called the Young Turks at the time. They weren't really the top dogs of New York City quite yet. There were, most importantly, two Italian mafia figures by the names of Salvatore Maranzano and Joe the Boss Mazzaria, who these Young Turks like Bugsy, Meyer, Lucky Luciano, they really, on the low, they despised him. They were called Mustache Pete's, these two guys, and there were many like them. They believed in old ways of thinking about, as far as organized crime goes. They were kind of racist. They didn't believe that Italians could work with other races like, Lucky was doing with his Jewish buddies, Meyer and Bugsy. So they kind of on the low plotted to take these guys out. And Bugsy was a key player in that, most notably taking part in the assassination of Joe the Boss Mazzaria in 1931 in Coney Island, one of the most famous mob hits of all time. And this is really in the midst of the Castellammarese War, where we would, at the end of that, we would see ourselves, opening up to a new form of organized crime, along with the five families of New York City, really establishing themselves, and as well as the National Crime Syndicate, which was pretty much a coalition of New York Jewish and Italian mobs, with Bugs and Meyer sitting at the top. Bugsy would also play a huge part in what was called Murder Inc., which was really Lucky Luciano's strong arm wing. Some say they took part in 1,000 hits. I don't know how true that really is, but it was probably somewhere around in the hundreds. And some say that Bugsy took part in as many as maybe 30 of these hits. And whether or not that's true, that would pave the way for his, legacy moving forward. And this was around 1931 when they finally took out Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. And now, Bugsy and these guys like Lucky and Meyer, as I mentioned, they were kind of done with the dirty work. They were trying to get more into the business end of things. And like I said before, Meyer being a little bit more business-minded and Lucky Luciano kind of like that too, Bugsy found himself as more of like their lieutenant. He was a little bit less bright, a lot more, like I mentioned, ill-tempered, and had more of a vicious street rep than his partner Meyer did specifically. Not that Lucky didn't. Lucky was widely feared. So fast forward a little bit, and the National Crime Syndicate would send Bugsy out west to expand their racket enterprise, where they really, didn't have much of a stronghold. And of course, Prohibition had ended, so they really set their sights on gambling as their mass earner. And Bugsy would settle into Las Vegas, of course, which was a smaller, kind of dingy gambling town when he got there, but he saw lots of potential in that early Las Vegas stages of what that city became known as today. And he started off just involved in gambling there, and many different styles of gambling, of course. And he also set up a national bookmaking ring headquartered in Las Vegas to start. And, after a while in Vegas, he really saw a lot of potential there. So he convinced the top mobsters on the East Coast and, the head of the syndicate leaders, like I said before, guys like Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Longy Zwillman in Newark, New Jersey. Those were like the main head guys of the syndicate. Al Capone too, in Chicago. He convinced them to start opening up casinos there, while they were kind of doing the same thing in Florida and Cuba, with their gambling operations, rising up there. Another new stronghold for them would be Vegas, and that's where Bugsy would put himself at the top. And he really made a name for himself. People were wondering who this very good-looking and flamboyant man was, mingling with the high class and fine women all around him. He took a mistress who would become famous on her own by the name of Virginia Hill. That's a story for another time. And he would, he would ask the syndicate to finance his Flamingo casino, which was really the first major casino out there in Vegas. And it's still around today. And at first, Bugsy came to the syndicate and he said it would be a little bit over $1 million to set this Flamingo casino up. And as time went on, the price tag on the casino was going up and up, and he kept, asking for more money to the syndicate, asking for more money over the few year span. And they kind of got tired of this. They were, it was really bothering them. They were like, well, I thought you said it was going to be just over a few million, and now you're asking for more and more money. Like, what's going on? Stuff like that. And long story short, it turns out by the end of the deal, the Flamingo is it costs like multi-millions of dollars to build. And they find out that Bugsy had been skimming lots of money off the top, and that was really what the problem was there. And this really ultimately led to his demise there. And on June 20th, 1947, he would be assassinated at his lavish Beverly Hills home. But the key point to make about the key point to make about Bugsy Siegel when you're, discussing him, I believe, is that he really is called the father of Las Vegas. And, Las Vegas really wouldn't be what it is today without Bugsy Siegel.
Mm-hmm. And apparently he found the name Bugsy disrespectful, from what I understand. No one said it to his face. It was always behind his back, because it was crazy as a bed bug or something, from what I remember reading.
Yep. Yeah, that is what I've heard. I think that goes with a lot of guys. Read the same thing about Lucky Luciano. People didn't call him Lucky to his face; they called him Charlie Lucky. And I've read the same thing about a lot of other gangsters of that time, and it's interesting. They have these renowned nicknames today, but then people don't even, in the time, people didn't really even call them that. So that is an interesting point.
Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little bit of peace, steady job and some food to eat. Just give me a little.
Another name that I've heard all throughout, my lifetime, and I'm excited to understand a little bit more about him. Low-key mob boss, who apparently had more power than the mayor. I'm talking about Carlo Gambino. Talk to me about how he became one of the most notorious mob bosses in history.
Yes, the secretive boss. Carlo Gambino is an interesting character. He really flew under the radar throughout his whole mob career for the most part. What really fascinates me about Carlo is, he was a mafioso through and through. And what many other mobsters can't say, Carlo could. He was a made man in Sicily at 19 years old. So you could imagine what kind of jobs he was working for the mob out in Sicily in his younger days. And he would really grow into what was one of the many inspirations for Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather. A lot of people try to set their finger on one inspiration for Don Vito, but I think it's a combination of bunch of mob bosses, but that's for another time too. So of course, Carlo is well known for being very secretive. And like I said, he was made in Sicily at 19 years old. So he was destined to become the legendary mob boss that he does. He came to the United States in 1921 illegally, stowed away in a ship and landed in Norfolk, Virginia, where I believe he was met by his cousins, the Castellanos, who one of them most specifically would be Paul Castellano, which would be his underboss and later his successor, who would be infamously whacked by John Gotti at Sparks Steakhouse in New York City. And Don Gambino, of course, not the Don yet, but he was highly respected instantly upon arrival, settling in Brooklyn. And he would jump right into Salvatore D'Aquila's organization in New York City and make a lot of money bootlegging, just like many other gangsters did during the Prohibition era. And in the shadows, he would be a part of that Young Turk group that I mentioned before in the Bugsy Siegel piece, really looking to overthrow the current regime of the mob called the Mustache Pete's, who had an old school mentality. They didn't believe in working with other mobs. Joe the Boss Mazzaria, for example, didn't want to work with people. He really, if he could have, he would have taken over the whole country's rackets. He really believed that everywhere was his territory. And these guys didn't like that. So Carlo Gambino saw, potential in that alliance with Lucky and these Young Turks, and saw that as the future of organized crime. And, he knew he would benefit from that alliance with those guys. And eventually he would, orchestrate a key role in the Castellammarese War and getting rid of these bosses, Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. And he would become a heavyweight in the newly formed one of the five families headed by Vincent Mangano, which would be the Mangano crime family. And Mangano would control that family for a while. And his underboss was Albert Anastasia, another notorious figure in mafia history. And he would eventually, take over the family by having Mangano and his brother Philip killed. And he would have no choice but to appoint the young and upcoming Carlo Gambino as his underboss. And this was another situation where Gambino remained silent. I believe there was a few instances where Albert Anastasia disrespected Carlo in front of a bunch of guys, and Gambino didn't really, react to it much. He kind of just kept to himself, but he knew what was going to happen in the future. And he teamed up with Vito Genovese while secretly teaming up with guys like Lucky Luciano again and Frank Costello. This is around like the 50s, to take over his family now from Albert Anastasia, who was really bringing a lot of heat to the mob. And Albert Anastasia would infamously get whacked in the barber shop, New York City. And there's a lot of disputes over that, who the hit squad was, what the order was, or who gave the orders. I'm pretty sure it was behind the scenes. It was Carlo Gambino had a lot to do with that. And with Albert out of the way, Gambino is where he was destined to be, and he becomes boss in 1957 after Albert Anastasia gets assassinated. And like I said, he's always operating in the darkness. He didn't really have much of a national name. His name would come up in papers here and there, but nothing to, give him that notorious reputation like his predecessor, Albert Anastasia, did, and some of his other former mob partners. And around, he would, to rewind a little bit, he was also a part of a lucrative ration stamp operation during World War II, and that made him a lot of money too, and that put him in a strong position. And what was really important to note about Gambino was that he was a huge earner. Okay. And that was really why, he was respected right away, other than the fact that he was made at 19, which is unheard of. But he would, as boss, expand his family massively into the 60s. And another important thing about Gambino that made him so powerful was that his son actually married the daughter of Tommy Lucchese, another fellow boss of the five family New York family. And they really combined to, control most of New York City's organized crime with this alliance and this family allegiance. And with the arrest of Vito Genovese, the retirement of Joe Bonanno, and a few other of the major players like Tommy Lucchese dying, in 1959, Carlo Gambino finds himself at the top of New York City's rackets and is established as the boss of bosses. And, he really would go on to make, apparently his family about $500 million a year, all while ruling with an iron fist in silence. No attempts on his life. They say that agents and authorities would be, monitoring his house and stuff like that, and they could never get anything on him, and he would still operate his family with no problem. And that's another point about Carlo Gambino and his secrecy that really just distinguishes him from other bosses. And I forgot to mention too that that wedding that I said before between his son and Tommy Lucchese's daughter was another scene out of The Godfather. And that wedding took place in 1962. So that's interesting to note. Like I said before, there's a lot of different inspirations for The Godfather. People try to put their finger on one person, and I think it's impossible. I think it's a whole bunch of different people. But, yep, he would control his family all the way up until his death in 1976 while watching his favorite team, the New York Yankees. And he would appoint his cousin, Paul Castellano, as his boss, or as the new boss, while he was on his deathbed. And another scene from Out of The Godfather was his lavish and famous funeral where there were 2,000 mourners. But, you know, if you're going to take one thing away about the life of Carlo Gambino, I would say, of course, he emerged as one of the boss of bosses in New York history, and really as one of the most powerful mob bosses ever, but really, you know, working in the shadows. Unlike many other mob bosses, he didn't have the same notorious reputation as some of the guys before him. He was very secretive.
And one thing that I found interesting about him, and I want to ask you if this is common in the mob, but I understand he was 100% against the sale of heroin and cocaine, going as far as to make a rule that anyone caught dealing would meet their certain death.
Yep.
Was that just him, or is that like has that always been a mob thing?
Well, I have my theory on that. You kind of hear about that from some of the old school mob guys, specifically like Carlo Gambino saying that. I kind of think they said that to get the, you know, hysteria off their back from, you know, public outcry, as well as the pressures from police and stuff like that, because, you know, that the war on drugs has always been around, whether, you know, it's what's the word I'm looking for, apparent or not. That was declared in like 1915. The mob has really, not of late, but through the really up until like the mid to late 60s, the mob controlled the drug trade. Whether you know, I almost call it a myth that the mob wasn't in to drugs. I think Carlo kind of just made that known. So, you know, he said it maybe to put some fear into his guys, to not do it, but they were doing it, and that made him a lot of money, whether he wanted to admit it or not. And I could name you a couple guys that I know that were under his wing that were involved in drugs. For example, I believe I mentioned him on your show before. A huge dealer was a guy by the name of Tony Granza. They called him Tony Scunge. Okay. And he actually cohorted with Bumpy Johnson's mob, and they controlled the drug trade in Broadway and parts of Manhattan, other parts of Manhattan, in the Bronx and Harlem. And that was a huge operation that lasted for a little while. And that's not the only one. So, yeah, to answer your question, excuse me, I think, in my opinion, Carlo kind of just said that as a front, in a sense. I think he knew that he was making a lot of money from drugs, but he kind of just wanted to take the heat off of his family and the mob in general.